We stand on the edge of profound change. To meet the demands of a green transition, we need collective wisdom, diverse voices, and bold ideas. Collaboration is the key to unlocking our sustainable future. Together, we can overcome the challenges ahead and seize the opportunities that will define the green economy.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, everyone. Very tough act to follow. But I was wondering this morning, how many people would be here today, whether anyone would still be in the mood. And you might not see under the shining bright lights, but the bags under some of the panelists' eyes, including my own, are quite long. But I suppose if there is any power in community, then it's great to be in a really full room to have this incredible discussion today. So very honored to be here and very honored to be moderating this panel. As we heard, this is about financing the green transition and the role of national transition plans in doing that. And, we heard today that the transition will require huge system-level change. We've also heard that system-level change is not easy, and it doesn't just happen. If we look at the climate financing gap, it's 7 trillion per annum till 2050. If we look at the nature finance gap, it's even more stark in terms of the money that's going to local communities and indigenous populations, and we look at the complexity around nature finance. And we saw last week at COP that mobilizing public finance is certainly difficult alongside the challenges of private finance that we've heard about today as well. Comprehensive transition planning is essential for achieving the triple ambition, if you like, of Paris, of Montreal, and of the Sustainable Development Goals. It is abundantly clear that these three agreements are interconnected. The science is clear that you cannot deliver on Paris without looking at nature, and vice versa. And if there's one lesson we take today, and the words of Sean are still ringing in our ears, it's that the transitions need to be just, they need to be tangible, and they need to be felt by the communities that we all seek to serve. So delivering on these commitments will require a whole of economy shift. Every government, every financial institution, and every corporate will need to think strategically about how to contribute to this and how to rewrite the economy onto a low emissions, nature positive, and socially positive path. And the current transition planning documents, be they NDCs, NBSAPs, national adaptation plans, are all insufficient to meet the moment. Where they exist, they're often the purview of just environment ministries alone. They don't represent a whole of government strategy. And over a third of NDCs fail to include any commitments around climate financing. And so we need to meet this moment. And as we gear up for the next round of NDCs that are coming next year, as governments scramble to pull together national nature plans and biodiversity action strategies, it is clear that both governments, industries, and financial institutions alike need to ramp up ambition. But this ambition alone will not deliver progress. They need to be operationalized through clear, quantified roadmaps, and they need to deliver on investable plans that quantify the investment needs and provide clarity to the private sector and to finance alike. And so in this context, this discussion today on national transition plans is really critical, and transition plans can play a really critical role in helping to operationalize these commitments and demonstrate a whole of government integrated strategy that can provide clarity and policy coherence to the private sector and finance alike. Now, the good news, which we're all seeking, is that there is momentum building around this agenda. And last year, the G20 published the Transition Finance Framework that goes into detail and sets out clear principles on transition financing. This remains a key priority for the G20 through the Sustainable Finance Working Group and the Task Force on Mobilization for Climate Change. We see initiatives like the Transition Planning Task Force that's seeking, and GFANs that are seeking to operationalize this and provide clear guidance and frameworks to the private sector and financial institutions. So momentum is building, but it's clear we need to ramp up further. And in this context, I'm really excited to welcome this esteemed panel that we have here today. So we have CAMILLA Bourne, MBE, a senior climate advisor who works with governments, businesses, and the third sector alike. and advised the COP26 and COP28 presidencies. We have Stephen LIZARS, partner in the Sustainable Finance team at Deloitte UK, and he was a member of the Transition Plan Task Force. Sophie Fry, head of ESG policy development at Barclays, and among many other things, was a member of the Secretariat of the UK's Transition Finance Market Review, and JOSUÉ TANAKA, a visiting professor at LSE, formerly of the World Bank and EBRD, where he was the founding leader of the Climate Finance Initiative and managing director for climate action and operational planning. JOSUÉ also advised the Brazilian G20 presidency on the Sustainable Financing Working Group. So we have a great panel here today across sectors and across geographies. So it'd be great to start setting the scene and maybe take a step back. So Stephen, if I could start with you, could you give us the 101? What exactly is a national transition plan and what's included within them?
Well, I guess maybe to start with, what's a transition plan? And I guess the easiest way to think about it is how you get it done. So if you set your commitment, you've got your stretching ambition, what are the things you're going to do to actually deliver on that? And you're elevating it up to a national level. So as you mentioned, there's been a lot of work in the private sector, the Transition Plan Task Force, sort of setting out what does a good transition plan look like. Essentially, there are 5 pillar models. So it's what's that ambition? What are you trying to do? What's the implementation steps for it? How are you going to engage? The metrics and targets to keep you honest and show you're delivering, and then how you're embedding that in governance. So if you elevate that to a national level, that looks at how you're going to decarbonize the different sectors of your economy. Is it hydrogen? Is it electric? What are you going to be doing around transport? So what does that overall ambition look like? How are you going to implement? What are you going to do with public procurement, with adaptation, with investment plans, fully costed investment plans? How you invest, and then engagement, how you're thinking about engaging with civil society, with the international community, what are the steps you're going to be taking? How are you going to embed that and track it through time? And then what's the accountability measures in government? So that's how you elevate it up into a national transition plan. But it's very embryonic, I would say. But it's quite clear that you need those steps if you're going to show how you're going to deliver. And then on top of that, that tells you what should be in it. You really need to go to the next step is it achievable? So is it credible? Is it investable? Is it going to work?
Fantastic, thanks Stephen. And JOSUÉ, if I could turn to you next, could you help us paint the macro picture? Why are these transition plans needed and how might they actually help to mobilize more and better climate finance?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. So I think the role they play is that essentially, if we try to look at 3 steps, the transition plans are in a way the link in between. And what do I mean by this? That you have macro country plans, such as NDCs, for example, such as the national adaptation plans, etc. And on the other hand, you also have the so-called investment program, and in a way the part that connects to the money, right? But in between, these transition plans come in because you need, as Stephen mentioned, you need to have, the intermediate translation of what the general objectives and goals and commitments are into, more specific actions, right? And more specific, objectives that the government may have. And that provides the connector, to essentially define specific investment plans. And I guess we may discuss later, how that comes in. So in the context of the discussions, with the G20, with Brazil in the presidency this year, they really focused a lot on these 2, I would say, the component 2 and component 3 of the sequence, right? The NDCs and the NAPs, the NDCs in particular are more UNFCCC territory. They're more, what's going to be happening, in Baku, and hopefully something happens by February in that. But, the focus of the Brazilians was really, 1, go deeper on the transition plan definition and what they mean practically. And number 2, something that we may talk about, later on, which are these notions of country platforms, in which you essentially try to take specific priorities from these plans and translate them in terms of the policy, specific policy and investment plans, which then lead to the financing.
Fantastic.
I forgot to say, an impact, right? Because finance is only one means then to impact. Great,
thank you, JOSUÉ. And Camilla, if you could help us unpack that a little bit more. There's almost an alphabet soup in the space of NDCs, NBSAPs, national adaptation, NAPs. How do transition plans bring them all together, and how can we ensure that they become a coherent strategy that links all of those strategies together?
Wow, that's a really simple question for me. Thank you very much. So yes, we have an alphabet soup of different policy frameworks that we need to engage with, and I think they all have their place. I mean, NDCs are owned by a particular constituency, informed by science. They feed into the UN climate process. You wouldn't want to have all of your industrial strategy and your investment plan embedded in that, because that needs to be accountable to the international community. Doesn't feel like necessarily a fully comfortable thing. But to realize that, you then do need all of the other pieces of the puzzle. So I think, as we've heard from JOSUÉ, and we've heard that we need that structure of a transition plan to pull together all the different pieces. So you have these bird's eye view policy frameworks at the international level that then gets translated, as JOSUÉ said, either into sectoral plans or investment plans. And the transition plan is a kind of mechanism to bring it all together, because we know now that climate action is not a purview of an environment ministry. It is a whole of government competency. And the transition plan is effectively an organizing principle that allows you to bring that all together. It's interesting, the way you described it, JOSUÉ, is you're saying you go from NDCs and you translate into these other things. In some governments, if I think about the UK government doesn't necessarily have a transition plan per se, but it has a lot of policies which have already translated pieces of NDCs or NAPs or NBSAPs, but they haven't then come together under one umbrella necessarily. So it's sort of, there's different places in which it can intervene, but the fundamental thing for me is it's that whole of government coordination that really makes it worthwhile.
Wonderful, thanks, Camilla. And Sophie, coming to you, would love to hear the kind of banker's perspective on this. And so it would be great if you could speak to us a little bit about Barclays' approach and how a national transition plan can help to guide finance from the private sector and from financial institutions.
Yeah, I think really simply at the most simple level, national transition plans are very important for providing that kind of certainty and that forward-looking long-term roadmap, which gives investors confidence to lock up capital and invest in the critical climate technologies and other investments to support the transition. And it is that, that long-term look, which has at times in the UK and other places been missing, where you have a chop and change of policy, you have uncertainty about what that forward path looks like. And so I think the discussion around, a national transition plan is critical. It can be, as we've discussed, a really clear, organizing document, organizing plan against which financial firms and others can allocate finance against, can understand, where does this government most support finance flowing? How can we best support that? Because if you think about mobilizing capital for the transition, some of it will be public finance, the vast majority will come from the private sector. And so I think having those transition plans at the national level and then also filtering that down through to the real economy, individual firms having their own transition plans, they can hook those into what that national transition plan looks like. And then you create an ecosystem against which transition finance can more effectively be allocated.
Amazing. And so it'd be great to hear from the panel just, what's the state of play with them now? Because they all seem, it seems obvious from your comments that they're really critical, but where are we now? And Stephen, would maybe love to hear from you, what are you seeing in the market at the moment on national transition plans, and to what extent is the private sector engaging with them as well?
Yeah, well, I was just part of the transition finance market review, and it was one of our recommendations. And obviously that was that was encouraged and mandated by the government. They wanted to understand, how do you mobilise transition finance in the UK economy? And that was one of the clear recommendations back to government. A plan builds confidence. So as Sophie said, it builds the confidence of understanding the pathway and what I should invest in. That reduces risk for any investor, requires a lower hurdle rate of return, should encourage more finance to come through. But I think the other thing it does is I see some reluctance sometimes in the financial sector to understand is what I'm financing good? So is it aligned to a plan that is essentially good? Am I going to be criticised for financing something that's not aligned to a transition? It's not inherently green, but it's an important stepping stone. So is it good or not? And I think that's an important thing that it unpicks too. I think any government these days is thinking about how it attracts more private sector finance. All governments are under stretch. Those enabling mechanisms are really important. So I think there's a very good dialogue. It's the right time. We're coming up to the refresh of NDCs. It feels very logical to be extending it further and starting to produce these transition plans. They're not going to be perfect. They're going to be criticised. They need to evolve, but they have to start somewhere. And I think that's a very important signalling between the private and public sector. And I think there's rightly some excitement around that.
And Sophie, you're also part of the task force. Do you see that we have the right kind of enabling conditions at the moment in the UK to enable finance to flow? Is that transition planning framework there?
I think there's been a really positive, step change since Labour came in. I think all the signals coming out are really positive. I mean, even just in the last 24 hours, you've had the NESO publish their kind of pathway around clean power. I think just taking that as sort of one subsector, you've had lots of clear communication from Chris Stark as head of mission control. You've had a clear plan of action. People know when they're going to expect those updates. People can understand how they're thinking about those challenges. So I think there has felt like a lot of energy. I mean, a lot of recognition that it's a big task. There's still more detail to come. But I think across the piece, whether you're looking at the new National Wealth Fund or GB Energy or clean power, there's lots of, I think, willingness and positivity to engage in that and work collaboratively. I think, bringing together the government with the real economy, with the financial sector firms, and, as Stephen mentioned, the Transition Finance Markets Review, that was a really great way to actually get input from a wide range of stakeholders, both in the UK, but also considering the UK's role as a global leader when thinking about some of these challenges.
And JOSUÉ, speaking of global leaders, it feels like an inflection point where Brazil is, recently hosted the G20 presidency. We hear a lot of momentum in the lead up to Belém next year. Could you speak to us a little bit about how the Brazilian government is thinking about transition planning and any successes on country platforms that you mentioned as well?
Well, perhaps I cannot yet say the success, but at least I can tell you, the road perhaps to success. Look, I think there perhaps it's good to have an example, and I think it's also good to make a point about institutional capacity of countries, right? Because whereas the UK to a certain extent may have the technical means, to really look at the whole of government approach, multi-sector, this is not the situation, in most developing countries, right? And therefore, when I mention this notion of country platforms and of essentially focus, is because to a certain extent, if you try to catch everything at once, implementation-wise is just too heavy. The Brazilian example is actually a very nice one. It actually involves the firm for which NASEER works for, which was really a minister of finance asking for an ecological transition plan. It doesn't happen every day, to have that. On the basis of this, and the work that was done, by Systemiq with the Brazilians, there was an identification of 6 priority action areas, right? And then what's very interesting is then in the context of the G20 discussions this year, there was a lot of discussion on transition plans and on essentially these country platforms to develop and bring the investment necessary for some of the transformations in these sectors. And what's very nice is that, in fact, last week in Washington, DC, Brazil actually launched, its own platform in order, to seek the finance for 3 out of the 6 areas in that, ecological transition plan. So it's early days, right? I mean, it was a very nice event, everybody, is very happy. But, what I mean, it's nice in the sense that it shows, if you want, this sequencing, between a G20 discussion, which to many often sounds, very stratospheric, and one says, what does it mean in practice? Translated into a national plan of a country, which then, translates into a specific mechanism that we now will see, will go into implementation at the moment.
And how is Brazil thinking about the trade-offs between the different priorities, and is that captured within, the strategic framework going forward?
Look, I wasn't in the discussions in Brazil on the selection. Perhaps I could tell you that the 3 areas that were chosen were, not surprisingly, energy transition, even though Brazil is already quite advanced in that. The second area I think is very interesting because it's one that you don't see very often, is industrial decarbonization linked to mobility. And the third one is one that's very important to the Brazilians, which is land restoration, right? Which has a lot to do, you know, with some of the priorities right now, particularly in the agriculture sector. So that's, in a way, the three that were selected, right? I assume that there must have been an economic argument, you know, reasoning behind that. And they may also have been a combination of policy objective, particularly the land restoration, together with financeability, because energy transition, for example, you would expect that private sector finance will really do the bulk, you know, of that. So what's very interesting is that very likely the finance composition for each of these areas will be quite different, right? The mix of public and private, and how the mix between public and private will evolve over time.
Thanks, JOSUÉ. And Camilla, are you saying, you know, the green shoots of progress around the world on country platforms and transformation plans?
So I think there's a real growing appetite for having transition plans and country platforms, and that is testament to the fact that, you know, doing climate-related action isn't just a nice moral thing to do, or the thing we have to do for the climate, which we also shouldn't forget. But nonetheless, there are a whole range of different equities involved, and you know, countries are realizing that if you want to be a modern economy, then that's the direction you want to go in. And also, if you want to attract investment, it's the direction you want to go in, because that is also where the pools of capital are moving around the world and where they want to go. So I think that is creating a lot of dynamism. It's not easy, though. And I think that having spent lots of time in the sort of more diplomatic space, and we've spent a long time talking about finance, and what I mean by finance is numbers of something from X to Y, and now we are doing financing. And ing is much more complicated, and ing takes time and is a process. So different economies have different structures, need different things, and are struggling with that. I was involved in the Vietnam Just Energy Transition Partnership. That was kind of one way of building out a sense of country platform. There are lessons to learn from that, and on the upside and the downside. There was a signal of intent. We want to go to net zero by 2050. There was an appetite to phase out coal. And then that cascaded from that kind of political leadership to, okay, how do we partner and collaborate to do this? Oh, the South Africans just got a nice chunk of change. We would like that chunk of change. What can we do about that? And then it became a political conversation, and that political conversation could be done quickly. It was a diplomatic announcement between a set of partners in the public and the private sector, as well as the country itself. But then comes the rub. What does the implementation look like? And then I think that's the thing that's been encouraging about the JETPs. They're not perfect, although if you can come up with another model, it ends up looking rather like a JETP. So, you know, it's worth kind of leaning into them, I think, and trying to make it work. But they, over their first year, they came up with their resource mobilization plan. And that, again, just in and of itself is a kind of impetus, a pulse through a government to try and organize yourself. And governments are busy, distracted. We live in a very complicated world, and this is a good organizing principle. So it's in its infancy, it's in its early days. They all look different. We all have to learn from one another, but we do see interesting things coming up. I also think that the way that the Egyptians led on this was they didn't start with international partners. They just started with what do we want, and then how do we bring international partners to do this? It didn't, okay, yes, they were hosting a COP, but it was even more homegrown. And I think that has ensured that their model is even more enduring than some of them that have depended on that big political impetus at the beginning. But there's different ways of doing it, and we're just going to have to keep trying and keep seeing what works and what doesn't.
And I think a couple of the panelists have mentioned this whole of government approach. And you know, when we think about the trade-offs, you know, coming from the nature space, you know, if we look at the impact that mining, there was a big study last week that was published in the FT about, you know, 1.4 million hectares of forest have been cut down, you know, directly impacted by the mining sector. Yet mining is a really critical sector for the energy transition. And if we then think about a national transition plan that's having to bring a whole of government approach together, where you might have, you know, yes, the Minister of Environment, the Ministry of Forestry, the Minister of Natural Resources, and then the Finance Minister in place. You know, what are the challenges, and have you seen any of this kind of working well? Anyone on the panel want to take this one?
Let's say I would go back to, again, I will betray one of my origins with the French education. which is Descartes, right? So that philosopher, the approach is if you have a very complicated problem, which climate change unfortunately is, then try to break it in as many pieces as you can to have pieces that are perhaps more manageable, right? So the way I look, for example, at this, the JETPs, for example, that CAMILLA has mentioned, well, that's in a way follows that Cartesian approach. You're not solving all of Vietnam's climate change challenge, but you're really trying, for a particular priority of that government to come with a response. The one question that comes, which is then my nerdy systems analysis background, is okay, when you do that, there are interlinkages, right? But one of the challenges, in my view, in being able to get to results, right, is to have, to a certain extent, a certain level of management of the complexity level. Because once you start saying that everything is connected to everything else, yes, it's true, but then what do you do, right? It becomes very complicated. On top of it, I think to get in practice, the notion, for example, of the governance, what are the implications in administrative terms, often in countries, which may have very limited institutional capacity, and you put all these interactions to be managed at once, it's, again, unmanageable, right? So that is part of the logic of, in a way, this sectoral or thematic approach. And, okay, a country like Brazil perhaps has the capacity of focusing on 3, at the start, and a country like the UK maybe has the capacity to deal with it overall, right? But we need to take into account the reality and the capacities on the ground.
If I could just add, I think one of the previous panels talked about de-siloing, and I think that is really critical when thinking at delivery at a national level. My background's in UK government and has not traditionally been fantastic at working across all the different departments to deliver things like we'll have to deliver when we think about transition planning. I think the mission control and the clean power, it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out and whether that can actually stay above some of the traditional silos that government gets locked down into. But finding, I think, new ways to operate in government, potentially drawing on lessons where it's worked well in other times for other issues, whether that be around, say, COVID vaccines or other success stories internationally, I think will be really important. It's not necessarily easy. It's not a topic that sounds, very sexy to think about actually how government works, but I think it is one of the critical elements of actually being able to deliver a lot of what this ambition is setting out to do.
And I guess from my perspective, most of my clients are in the banking sector. And what the banks are trying to do is they're trying to decarbonize the different sectors they lend into, their financed emissions. And what we advise them is you have to take a sector-by-sector approach, because the solution for decarbonizing residential housing is very different to the solution for decarbonizing air transport. So you build it up sector by sector with this overarching framework, but then there are linkages. So if I know someone has just bought an electric vehicle, the chances are they may be interested in retrofitting their home or introducing solar or battery. So looking for those obvious connections, and scaling up to government is the same. There are different sectors of the economy, creating that ambition for the sectoral decarbonisation pathways. They need to be built bottom up, but with an overarching framework, and then looking for those obvious linkages. So I think JOSUÉ put it very nicely, breaking it down into the components, but the logical components, following those pathways.
Perhaps a mini comment also on this point on government and whole of government. So I think there are two remarks, quick. One is to see the rising potential role of ministries of finance in climate action. That wasn't the case, but a few years ago, there's been a creation of something called the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action. And one of the aspects, that underpins is very much this aspect that ministries of finance do have that kind of coordination role. So that's the first comment. The second comment is also that the governance arrangements to drive JETPs, for example, what's very interesting, they're very different when you go from one country to the other, right? CAMILLA mentioned Egypt, that tends to be one ministry that then tries to coordinate the others. You go to South Africa, it was at the level of the, it is, I think, a level of the president, etc. So the arrangements locally will be very different in order to try, to have this, intra-government coordination.
And maybe I'll just make a final, I really very much agree with the comments on the governance, and I think that goes for governments, and I think it also goes for businesses and investors, because they're not used to necessarily working in that way, and it's a big learning curve, and we're going to have to keep trying and keep innovating and finding new ways to do it. But I'll also just make a comment about the trade-offs point. I think that in the green and the climate-related spaces, we've had this idea that what we've been building towards is utopia. And the reality is, if you're making change and doing things, there are winners and losers. And I think we have to be a bit realistic about that. And it's better and healthier to look in the round and make some of those choices, but there will also be fallout. So of course there will be environmental implications of using critical raw materials and extracting them, but then should we not do it? And I think that we just need to give ourselves the shades of grey to do that. And I think there's discussions, for example, around transition finance as well as green finance are helpful in that way, because they try and find a practical bridge to some of these things. And I think we're going to have to increasingly embrace those kind of tools that allow us to do things, because doing things that are mainstream are murky, and that's where we are now. We're in the mainstream.
It's a gift and a curse that we're in the mainstream, and that's no, that's clearly true. And in a sense, I love that we've gone from Descartes to utopia and covered all the philosophy in between. But just before I open up to the audience for panel questions, maybe I'd just love to hear just a very quick reflection on, I guess one of the themes of the day has been the collaboration, the radical collaboration that's needed to get to the green transition. Maybe 30 seconds each on what do you see as the barriers and what's needed from other actors in the space to come together. JOSUÉ, why don't you start us off?
All right. Well, I think we talked about this notion of country platforms. I think there's a lot of expectations around it. It's essentially building the next generation, following on the example of the JETPs. In theory, they're engineered precisely to bring that coordination at country level, to bring the mobilization, of the financing sources, that may come both from the public and the private sector. So that's the challenge. The challenge is that as a concept, it's a very powerful concept. In the practice of individual countries, with all the complexities of everyday life, not to include the results of certain elections, then that becomes the, I would say, challenge of every day. To close on this one on an optimistic note, there is a momentum at the macro level. There is interest by many countries, but we need to see how to translate that in practice.
Thanks, JOSUÉ.
I would say it needs to be collaboration with buy-in. I think there's a lot of collaboration happening in lots of different pockets. You need to make sure the people around the table are actually bought in to listening, to understanding, and then taking forward those solutions. And then I think the second thing is making sure it is kind of a whole value chain approach, so that you don't just have, people in one corner talking about, say, scaling up hydrogen production without thinking about, say, offtake or the demand or the end use. So I think that buy-in and then the full value chain approach is critical when thinking about collaboration.
Maybe a bit of confidence to be a little bit wrong as well. I think there's a pressure for everyone to be right and to have the answers. And I think the confidence to put something out there, take feedback, take that engagement and adapt. I think we'll all do better for that. But that applies to everyone rather than any single actor.
And the comment I'll make is that I think it's invaluable to have the broad spectrum of non-government actors externally, from civil society, think tanks, academia. And it's a really challenging phase that we're entering into, because we've seen a lot of civil society space shrink across the world. And that makes it challenging, but we need that accountability and that light to be shone on it. And, with South Africa, that South Africa JETP would not have come about if it hadn't been for the richness of that South African landscape. Working in Vietnam, incredibly different. And it will absolutely implicate the implementation of those different plans, and also help with the political roller coasters that you might be going on as well.
Thanks. Thank you, Camilla. So we'd love to open up for questions, and we'll take it in the spirit of Stephen's guidance that we should all have the confidence to be a little bit wrong as we answer them. But does anyone have any questions? Wonderful.
Hi, I agree there's merit in having national transition plans, but as Camilla mentioned, you know, governments tend to be busy and distracted, and with potential change in governing parties every few years, issues largely get politicized and not necessarily in the interest of the people or at national, international level. So my question is about accountability. You know, who keeps who accountable?
Thank you. Stephen, do you want to take that on?
Yeah, I mean, obviously when you've got a political cycle, there is a risk of change, for sure. It's probably easier to answer the question and the alternative, which is, you know, what if we don't? And yeah, I think if you don't have this, then you're missing, you know, that communication of confidence to your international partners, to the private sector. So there is clearly a risk. As we see with the change in political winds, that plan could change, the overall commitments could change. But I think you have to start, you have to put something out there, you have to be prepared to change it, and hopefully win through with the force of the arguments and the success that comes from it. But yeah, you can't take away the risk that these things will be changed. I just don't think that's possible.
I would just say it's a very strong incentive to make whatever you're trying to do work, right? Because if it works, it's much harder to have an argument to remove yourself from. If you have something that you started in a previous government that stayed in discussion for 3 years, that doesn't really go very far, it's very easy to discount this, you know, in the next opposition government.
And I suppose it brings everyone around a table in a dialogue in the first place. So you set the rules of the game, and it's harder to roll back from that.
And frankly, a lot of the policies are very popular. Like, people like cleaner air. People, if you've ever driven an EV, you don't want to go back. If you have a heat pump, you're like, this is great. So I do think that the proof is in the pudding of delivery, as has been said, and that does help with accountability as well.
This question at the back.
Yeah, what is the one biggest challenge you see to the success of national transition plans in the next few years? And you can't mention he who mustn't be mentioned. I mean, there's the governance, money, communication.
Anyone on the panel want to take that one?
My one word: capacity.
Yeah, it's another thing. It feels like it never stops, but that's because we're all getting smarter about what it takes. So it's kind of easy to reject it. So, oh, not another thing that I have to do. You know, what's this new framework? But I think the private sector's learning, public sector's learning. We're all understanding what it takes, what the barriers are, and that does involve us having to step up and do something different all the time. But yeah, capacity is the right word.
I would also say that I think it is upfront capacity, upfront investment, but pay off over a longer time, where you need to essentially probably do less from the central government standpoint. I mean, we often get calls from a government to say, what do you mean you don't understand our strategy? We've put 3,000 pages out on, you know, what we're going to do on this thing. And you think, yes, but it's split between, you know, 10 different documents sitting in very small different pockets. And so hopefully if you do a good national transition plan in sort of one place that pulls it together, you end up having to probably do less potentially down the line.
And what are the mechanisms of supporting increased capacity? You know, have you seen anything work well?
I mean, I think part of it was, for example, the example I gave with South Africa. I think a lot of work being done in different fora in different places, that does create a much more, you know, a rich landscape that can feed into that and give that accountability. I also think that one of the benefits of the Just Energy Transition partnerships is that they are at a political level, so the political timetable drives a consistent spotlight, which also puts the media spotlight on it. So I think those kind of dynamics can help and hinder.
Yeah. Two points here. One is the importance of local, because often with lots of good intention, you have a lot of external assistance, but that external assistance doesn't stay. You know, it comes in the airport and then leaves in the airport, you know, or from the airport. So that's one. And the other one is obviously the financing support, you know, for that kind of work, right? So, you know, kind of technical assistance, money, etc., that is available.
Thanks, JOSUÉ. I think time for one more final question, if there's any.
Hi, I'm sort of zeroing in on the UK. I mean, I absolutely support your views on that the current government is going absolutely in the right direction. But there are a couple of things that I would be concerned about. I mean, there's now an increased government borrowing, and I think if you look at the United States, for example, there's probably going to be some upwards pressure on interest rates which would not have otherwise been there. And to what extent do you think that individual projects are going to be sensitive to this sort of macroeconomics? And a second point is, and I'm not an expert on this, but I just get the impression that there's a move back to the 70s idea in the UK of picking industrial winners. Is that true, and is it a problem? Sorry, is it an issue, particularly for equity investors?
I think on the second one, look, the government's put out a green paper on the industrial strategy. They've set out some views on sectors. They're discussing kind of subsectors there, and I think they're taking all feedback on that and whether we end up in a world of picking winners or not. So I think that we'll hopefully get more clarity in the coming months as they develop that industrial strategy. And, you know, I think that we'll have to see how that lands and where the government's plans will lead us there.
If you get it right, it can be very effective. I mean, sending a very strong market signal that this is what we're backing, as I said earlier on, it de-risks. As an investor, I'm looking for a certain return for a certain risk. If I can reduce the risk, I'll take a lower return. So that can mitigate an increased interest rate environment to some extent. So I think it's a very important signalling. Correct, it could be a micromanagement of the economy, and I think there would be many that would reject that as a principle. But it's giving those very clear signals where there's a fork in the road and you're stopping investment because people aren't confident to invest because they don't know which direction you're going to take. There's some quite clear areas of the economy in the decarbonisation space where it's very important that people understand where regulation, where policy is heading. No more than that necessarily for some of them to have that confidence to invest.
Wonderful. So I think we are coming up to time. So I just want to thank, firstly, all the panelists for incredibly thoughtful and inspiring remarks today on a day when we needed some good news. And thank you all for the amazing questions and the attention. I think the kind of key takeaways for me are that the national transition plans are absolutely critical to provide clarity to private sector, financial institutions, and actually to local communities and within government as well, right? To bring everyone together around a table, around a shared plan that brings NDCs, NBSAPs, adaptation plans, development plans all together into one place. We had a really core theme inspired by Descartes of de-siloing, both within government, across sectors within an economy and across also value chains. We heard the criticality of accountability to make sure that this is just, that civil society are involved and it's not just government around the table. And I think finally we heard that there was green shoots of progress. We heard from Brazil, we heard from Vietnam, South Africa, that there are inspiring examples that we can take forward. And there was also the added bonus of a gold star for the UK. So I hope we all leave here today. And I think we've got 1 or 2 more sessions before the cocktails and canapes, but hopefully we can all raise a glass to that. So thank you very much, everyone. And I'm looking forward to the next panel too.